Hi guys, Claudia Boleyn here. Having a really good day today. It's been a good day for me, let me tell you. Okay, so I'm gonna do a video today which I've been thinking about for a while. And it might feel a little bit out there and a bit weird. Bear with me, my brain connects different things. Let me know what you think in the comments, of course. I've been watching a lot of Succession. Succession is one of my favourite TV shows. Sorry if I've moved camera issues. But what I wanted to talk about is the idea of the privileged victim. And that led me down a rabbit hole, right? As it does in my brain. So, one of my favourite TV shows of all time is called Succession. You might know Succession. It's about to hit its fourth and final series. I'm gutted it's ending. But it is a show that, although it's technically about the business world, it's about excessive wealth and capitalism and what that means, what that does to your humanity when you see people as pawns and life is like a game to be won, and kind of hyper masculinity and what that means. It's essentially a show about recycled trauma, intergenerational trauma, like the bonds between siblings, the conflicts between siblings who've grown up within abuse, and kind of how children who are emotionally neglected or emotionally abused or even physically abused or any other way of being abused, how they kind of become adults and how hard it can be in some cases to get away from that system and to find yourself. And the interesting thing about Succession, and why I want to bring it to the topic of today's video, is that what it kind of displays is the privileged victim thing, which is a specific sort of victim who is materially incredibly privileged, has more opportunities than most of us combined, so much wealth to spare they don't know what to do with it, best clothes, best holidays, best foods. But they've also had severe emotional neglect, abuse and control in their lives. And one of the specific problems here, and it's interesting to talk about this because obviously I can see why it's a difficult topic, because in a society which is capitalist and full of billionaires, and we have this kind of mentality, don't we, that in business it's every man for himself or every woman for herself. Now we've got girl bosses now. I don't know how it's feminist for great women now taking part in the same system, great, but I can understand where the disconnect comes in, because there's not a lot of sympathy to spare, because we live in a society where there's so many problems, there's so many people who are abused, and a lot of those people don't have resources, right? So obviously it's difficult when you've got people who have been abused or have mental health issues who don't have access to self-care. They can't take time off work. They're working every hour. They can't do these retreats. Like a lot of the kind of, I understand it. They can't do these retreats. They have more opportunity. So I can obviously understand that, because if you're someone who doesn't have those privileges, then it's very easy to just be like, why are you talking about that? Because, you've got the opportunity to kind of do certain therapy, you can pay for private therapy, all that kind of stuff. But what I would say is I don't like thinking about there being a sort of established amount of love and compassion to go around. Like, I don't believe in that. I believe that there is enough for everybody. So while I can completely understand why it can be hard to sympathise with very rich and privileged victims, or to even see them as victims, because we're in a society where there's a lot of poverty, capitalism has kind of set us all against each other. It's also not necessarily healthy, and it's making things quite difficult, because sometimes it means that we're not very good at recognising when abuse has taken place to somebody who is materially privileged. Now, we obviously know that this happens. So, for example, Marilyn Monroe. Marilyn Monroe was incredibly abused in her life. She was used by people, she had a lot of trauma, yet she was an icon. Right, she was a Hollywood starlet of the time, although, I would say her legacy is still kind of being used now in a lot of ways. Think about today, we've got someone like Britney Spears, who, is a celebrity and has all this wealth and stuff, but she kind of has struggled a lot with her mental health. She's been under conservatorship, she's not had a lot of financial control, so she's been very controlled financially. So we know it's a thing that happens. So I get very uncomfortable when people use the privileged victim thing to say that that person isn't a victim and shouldn't be complaining because they're very wealthy. And again, I'm saying this as a socialist, right? Because I think the problem is that if we lived in a more socialist society, that wouldn't even need to be a thing. We are in a society which by nature makes us feel competitive with each other in terms of money, right? And I'm not one of those people who goes, oh, you're just jealous because someone's rich. No, it's a valid anger, isn't it? There shouldn't be so much inequality in society. I don't see it as, I'm someone who thinks the rich should be taxed much more. People will say, oh, you're just jealous because they're richer. No, I just think that to live in a better world, if you earn more, you should be taxed more because, you know, we want to get to a place where we all help each other out, right? That's my worldview. But Succession. So Succession is obviously a show about trauma, and I'm going to make a comparison in this video, which you might think is completely mad. It's not a direct comparison as well. So I am not saying the royal family are, like in Succession, the Roy family, the business family, the dysfunctional business family. I'm also going to talk about a specific character who is called Kendall Roy, who is the second son of Logan Roy. If you don't watch Succession, I'll give you a very, very brief rundown here, is that the dad of the family is called Logan Roy. He is like business royalty. I mean, the show is called Succession because it's all about, he's like a king of his business empire. He is ridiculously wealthy, ridiculously privileged. And he has 4 children, although he only acts like he has 3 children. And it's about who's he going to name as his successor for the business, or basically his kingdom. And I feel like it's kind of representing how in the modern age, you know, this kind of idea of like emperors and kings and queens kind of does make more sense when you apply it to like modern day billionaires and their kind of legacy. And he's essentially got a court of people around him, sycophantic people who buy into this dream. It's like the emperor's new clothes, because it is a dream. Power is, like in Game of Thrones says this, you know, power is where people believe it resides. It's like a construct that we make up in our minds. And that's why, you know, when we see all these people, don't we, online, you know, telling people that, you know, you can do better in business if you change your body language, if you change the way you dress, change the way you walk. And it's true, because if you give off vibes of power, it's kind of self-perpetuating in a lot of ways. Because you often find out that people that are very rich and powerful, when it actually comes down to it, a lot of it is not what it seems, but everyone buys into the idea and it becomes like self-perpetuating. So it's like an idea of hierarchy and an idea of like a king, right? Everyone wants scraps from him. And again, this wouldn't happen if we were in a socialist society, because it shouldn't be that we have to like pal up to, you know, the rich horrible person to try and like get a little bit of money. But it's basically like the business world, but imagine it was like a medieval court. And it's kind of, to me, it's like, wow, that's how the system of like the medieval court has merged into the modern day. Now, Kendall Roy, the second son, he has been emotionally neglected his whole life and emotionally abused. He's witnessed abuse. And from the get-go, he is a very troubled, very traumatized individual, but he has huge, huge material wealth. And I would say he's probably the protagonist of the show, at least the first season. And I really do see a lot of comparisons between him and Prince Harry. Now, I'm not saying they're the same, you know, they don't react the same way, you know, it's not a direct comparison. But in terms of the specific situation of being materially privileged in a hierarchy, being kind of tied into a system that you're kind of indebted to, also denied your independence and individuality. You've been taught to bow down to the hierarchy. You've not been taught to be yourself. You know, that sort of severe emotional neglect and living as a brand. You know, I think that's what Succession does very well, because the Roy family are a brand. You know, the abusive father who rules the family constantly tells the press that he's this family man and everything he does is for his kids, but it's just branding, right? All the kids have to play their part and it's against their will. And I personally think that Kendall Roy is one of the best modern day characters. He feels almost Shakespearean to me, because he's kind of a character who has, in his heart, seems to have quite good morals, gentleness, a desire to be loved. He's not traditionally masculine, although he does try to act up and emulate his father when he feels powerless. He is one of the most empty characters, and I don't mean empty in terms of nothing going on inside, but empty in terms of he's almost checked out of himself, because he's grown up as part of a brand. He doesn't know anything else. The mechanism of the business, he knows is wrong. He's afraid of his father, but he also loves his father. He doesn't have any confidence in striking out on his own. And the most crucial thing that I was thinking when I was rewatching season 1 is that something that really ties this character in, which I felt kind of applied to Harry's situation, is the idea that nobody will listen to him if he were to talk about the abuse, right? So if Kendall spoke about his mistreatment and what he's gone through, the reaction he'd get in universe, and has been, is that he's just whining, that he should be grateful because his father's given him everything materially. You know, it doesn't matter about the emotional abuse, because, look, his dad is the richest person ever. Like, you should just be happy that you're not poor. There's also an inbuilt isolation in Kendall, because he's been raised among other rich people, there's a sense that he wants to connect with other people. You know, Kendall's interesting because he wants to be accepted very much. I think he's a very sympathetic character, although he doesn't do great things necessarily. He's very messed up by his upbringing, and you can really see that in the show. But he really wants to like relate to pop culture and relate to other people. He's very into rap music. It's kind of embarrassing sometimes. You know, he doesn't really fit because he's not got the same mentality as his father. He wants to progress things in the business more, but at the same time he hasn't known any other world, and he's been made to feel like he's nothing if not a brand. He is a character who's been raised as part of a brand, and now he doesn't know who he is. You know, there's a quote that he says in the show, and I'm going to make proper videos about Succession, but he says to his sister, I don't know, if Dad didn't need me, I don't know what I'd be for. Like, he doesn't feel like he has any worth outside of that performed role. And he can't go to anyone for help because he's so isolated. And he, in some ways, he can seem arrogant, he can seem pretentious. He doesn't always understand how privileged he's been. And I'm not saying, you know, I'm not getting at Harry in this because I think Harry is a lot better adjusted than Kendall Roy. But when I think of early Harry and what he went through, I feel like there's a deliberate, and William too, I feel like it's part of the conditioning to keep them in the system. You know, keep them apart from other people. And it's almost like that wealth and that privilege is used as a kind of barrier. I was kind of thinking about it like this. If you're young, like think about the Roy siblings, but also think about the Royals. If you're little and all you know is this abusive situation, which is built on money and hierarchy, and all the power is disproportionately in the place of a certain figure in your family, and everyone around you, all the adults go along with that, you already see that anyone who goes against that person is tarnished, rubbished, and smeared. And you don't want to be that person. You've got this very confused, almost worship-like love for them and the system. So if you are being abused in that system, it's got to be very, very hard to get the help and understand that and not be assimilated in. Because automatically, by nature of being part of the brand, so in Succession, you're being the children of a billionaire and a very, like, they do, like, right-wing news channels, like, Logan's company is awful. And in the case of the Royals, you know, you've got a kind of undemocratic institution based on colonialism and imperialism. By nature, those children become part of the brand and they feel the hostility, right? And it's obviously, we can see that's a genuine, it's right for there to be hostility against those ideas. But the children will probably feel it as, you know, that's their family, that's who they are. These people just don't understand them. It's so much easier for them to then be isolated by the people that want them to be isolated. If they say to them, look, that's what they think of you. Those people hate you, and you've not done anything to them, right? You know, they're not teaching those kids, obviously, in the system. It's not you they're angry at, and it's because the system's unfair. It's so easy to take those kids and say, look, I don't care about you. Look what they do to you. Like, you're in the right place. Don't ever go to them or become one of them, because they won't accept you. You know, it must be difficult, from a child's perspective, to feel hated by people because you're not understanding it properly. You know, when you're a child, you're not going to think. And I think about this in terms of George, Charlotte and Louis today, because they're going to be witnessing the protesters, right? I'm very pro the protesters, by the way. This is not me saying don't do it. You know, people, they're not my king people, the anti-monarchy sentiment. But I'm thinking about the indoctrination of those children and how to them, they're too young to understand it. You know, they're just going to be thinking, that's our family. Children are, you know, protective towards their family. They want to be safe. And it's like, oh, look, they're the bad ones. They want to destroy us. They're the outside people. Those are the people you don't want to associate with. And it's all part of the indoctrination. Because when you're a child, if you're a little child and you're being booed or you're hearing your family get booed, and you don't have the access to people outside of that bubble, because they don't, you know, in the case of the fictional Roy family and in the royal family, they surround themselves with kind of fawning courtiers who buy into the lie, right? Who buy into the delusion. Those people are going to become the threat and the enemy. And that helps those children get conditioned. It helps keep that distance. There's a reason they want, like, the heir, William, distant from the people, right? There's a reason why when Diana, and we know, you know, from, I'm not commenting on William as an adult, but what we do know is that as a child, for example, William really did suffer with, you know, the very public divorce of his parents. We know he was a very emotionally sensitive child. He was close to his mum. He felt things very, very strongly, which adds up. Right, in a situation where your mother is being kind of abused and is kind of falling apart and isn't getting support, the children, especially the oldest child, will try and be that support. So I imagine there was a lot put onto William, which is not the fault of Diana at all, but the whole system, he had a lot on his shoulders, a lot to deal with. They didn't like how Diana did things, and it worked with Harry. It worked with Harry, which is a miracle, and I talk about that all the time. But, Diana connecting William and Harry to normalness, like just other people outside of the bubble, was a threat. So when Diana died, I imagine it was very easy to get William back in. I really do. And I also imagine it was very easy to blame Diana. Because this is a child who's probably been leaned on very heavily by their mother, and how easy it would be for that system. I'm not saying they did this, but psychologically speaking, how easy it would be for that system to say, your mum was just a bit hysterical, and wow, she put so much on you, didn't she? That wasn't right. Don't worry, we'll do things properly. It's a grooming process, isn't it? And I think we have to be very careful about cutting off victims of abuse because they're rich. This is not me saying, won't someone think of the rich people? I'm a socialist. I'm not a fan of riches and capitalism and all that kind of thing. But we have to be very careful because in abusive situations, they will often make you dependent, right? They will teach you they will teach you not to be independent, and they will give you that financial security. Now, in the case of Harry, something he talks about in his book is how he never gained life skills which other people would deem to be normal. It's like he was raised in a sort of golden zoo, isn't it? Like a golden barred zoo, because things were done for him. There were certain elements of his independence that he wasn't allowed to have. And certain things that he found for himself, he was kind of looked down on for being independent. We know that Charles, for example, we hear that he has a lot of things done for him. Don't know how true that is, but I've heard that, he has like toothpaste put on his toothbrush and things are done a certain way. And it'll be very easy for us to just see that as pure laziness. And I'm not excusing Charles. He's a grown adult. He's a grown adult, and he's now fronting a system of imperialism and colonialism, which is undemocratic. But what I will say is that they groomed them in. Look at the heirs. They groomed them into a state of both helplessness and entitlement, because that keeps them in, right? It doesn't just hurt other people. It hurts the heir. It's conditioning them. Because the story of Succession is Logan Roy, the horrible abusive dad who's like the king of the system, basically grooming his children to succeed him. And there's also the added resentment that in a system like that, when your family runs like a succession, like a royal family, the knowledge that your children aren't just your children, they're the people who are they're gonna supplant you, right? They're gonna come next. They can't come into their being and their power until you're dead. And that has got to be incredibly damaging, and that's got to create some sort of, I'm not going to say resentment always, but difficulty between parent and child, right? Because that's the person who's going to come after you and take over. It's a very weird family setup. And like with the Roy family and like with the royals, they don't want those people to be individuals. They want them to feel like, and I almost wonder if this is what's happened with William, I think they want them to feel like there's no way out because these are your people. And those people won't accept you because you're so privileged and they hate you anyway. Like, there is no way out. There is no way out. Nobody would believe you even if you came forward and said you were struggling, because everyone would just laugh and say, what, you're struggling with your golden coaches and, with this whole system in place and all your houses. And that is a problem of capitalism, right? That's a problem of inequality. It shouldn't be that there's this, huge disparity in wealth. Now, in terms of Harry and Kendall, now in the show, Kendall has struggled with addiction issues. He kind of seems to have a lot of self-loathing. He can be impulsive, but he can also be really checked out and dissociative. It's like he's searching for meaning and freedom and peace. He's searching for permanence, a sense of safety, right? And a sense of family. And every time he tries for these things and they go wrong, the self-loathing kicks in. The messaging he's had from other people, which is better off in the system, get back in line and things will be all right. Every time something goes wrong, he's kind of sucked back in, because it's like the comfort of the material wealth and it's the safety of the abuse. If you've been raised in abuse, and this is not just for rich people, there's still a safety in that system because you know it. And abuse victims are being raised not to be very good at being independent. So a lot of the time that keeps them in anyway, because it's like, well, at least I know what's happening here. Like, I don't know how I'd cope on my own out there. But Kendall does have issues with drugs, etc. And it's interesting in the show, this kind of perception of Kendall, it's kind of used against him, right? It's like the kind of joke of like, oh, this rich guy who's just out there taking drugs. And really we see that this is self-medication. right? So he's been in recovery. He feels completely empty and worthless and doesn't know who he is. He doesn't know how to connect with people. Now, I would say Harry's pretty good with connecting with people, and I think the differences are, there are so many differences anyway, because the Roys are obviously fictional, but I think the influence of his mother, like, there are differences. But, you know, there are moments when Kendall is trying to relate to people early on, and sometimes he says things which might seem like grandiose or a bit like misjudged. You know, he doesn't necessarily think about his privilege, and I see that a lot in early Harry. Now, I think the tabloids really overdo this, by the way, because I think whenever I've seen Harry, he's very good at this. You know, he talks about how not everyone has the same means, but something I've seen used to attack Harry is, you know, people will say, it's all very well for him to say that, he's got all these means. You know, they do often misquote him, so I'm not even going to go into, like, the misquotes are ridiculous to make him seem out of touch. But even the misquotes, right, that aren't even true, even if they were true, I would say that expecting perfection from somebody who's navigating their way out of an abusive system they've been in their whole life is not something we can expect, or we should expect. Now, Harry, I think, is doing incredibly well, and I think Meghan is a lot to thank for that, because it seems like she's really supported him in his therapy, not feeling ashamed to talk about the issues and to really kind of delve into them and find who he is and find that sort of peace. But I think that the idea that, you know, Harry would have to be perfect. And also, let's say William. So one day in the future, I don't know if it will happen now. Say one day in the future, William were to come forward and to say, the system is abusive. I want out. I want my children out. I think when you're fresh out of that system, you're still kind of slightly groomed and indoctrinated. So it's a process. Like, you will move. It's a long process. For anyone who's been in one of those systems or understands them, it can take a whole lifetime to kind of navigate out of them and relearn things. So I feel like the kind of sad thing with the character of Kendall, for example, is that it's quite clear that he would have been happier and healthier in a normal family, right, without the extreme wealth. It's kind of, all it's done is allowed him to be further abused and then guilted and gaslighted, and it's kept him apart from ordinary people, right? So the people that he could go to for help, they think he's out of touch. They think he's this entitled prince character. And in some ways, like, you know, he is entitled. He is arrogant. He doesn't understand the world. A lot of his views are kind of iffy, although when you delve into them, I think there's a good man within Kendall. But what we also see in Succession, and which we see with the royal family, is that if anyone ever does escape, anyone who kind of does go against it, anyone who kind of finds their own way, in a family like that, in a system like that, it's not just a normal kind of, okay, then they're still part of our family, but, you know, with their own kind of boundaries, etc., let's all get on. There is a total smearing and humiliation. So that aspect also cannot be understated. So in the royal family, look what that, you know, they're smearing Harry beyond belief. And it's not just for Harry, it's a threat to anyone else inside the system, right? It's essentially a threat. And I would say the most sinister thing is that the people that's going to be the most threatening towards is actually the Cambridge children. You know, because that's what they're learning, right? Leave and you are nothing, you're ridiculed. Like, you need to be part of the system because only we can protect you from that. Like, otherwise you will become a laughingstock. With the merging of family and brand, family and business, family and monarchy, you know, it's not just a case of leaving an ideology you don't like, right? It's literally, it's losing your family. It is a situation which Kendall's in and the other royal children are into, and which Harry and William are in the royal family. If they step away from the ideology of monarchy, they will be smeared and they will lose their family. Not only that, they will be publicly ridiculed, right? It becomes news. It's on the front of all the papers. And bear in mind, these are also individuals who've probably grown up, again, material wealth, in some ways arrogance, certainly, although it's different depending on who's the scapegoat and who's the golden child and what your position is, but also being taught that your public perception is everything, and you've not been taught independence and the strategies to kind of deal with that kind of stuff. So you're even more vulnerable and even more likely to be afraid of that happening, which again is why it's a miracle that Harry's got out, frankly. And something else I just wanted to say very, very, very briefly here is that something that happens in Succession, which happens in all sort of dysfunctional and abusive families, and we see happening in the royal family, is the golden child scapegoat system. It's the system where the children are in competition with each other. So, for example, in the royal family, it's slightly different because there are already inbuilt roles. So, for example, in Succession, it's more of a, they have to fight it out, right? They're competition. Each of them are kind of competition for each other. And the father plays on that. Logan plays on that. He doesn't want them to unite. That's the point in these systems. Because nobody wants to get the worst treatment. Everyone wants to be the favourite and feel safe and feel loved, because love is kind of dangled over you. To be the scapegoat means, you know, total humiliation. And to be publicly known as, like, lesser in the order. So in the Roy family, they kind of have to fight for it. Although I would say there's different interesting politics going on there, because one of the, you know, Logan has a daughter called Siobhan Roy, and it's interesting to see her role, considering she's a woman in this kind of patriarchal, toxically masculine world, you know, and what that means for her. That's a whole other video. Shiv Roy is a fascinating character, but in the royal family, the actual roles are in place. So it was very much Harry was born the scapegoat and William was born the golden child. However, I'm not saying the family do this, but the media is very different, because it is still a case of them having to fight each other for positive PR. We see that going on now with the different PR camps. It's very much, we can't coexist happily, because in this media frenzy and cycle that we're part of, someone has to get the dodgy headlines in order for the other one to thrive. And of course that's Harry's role, right? That's the scapegoat and the spares role. But the whole point of that, again, is so that those individuals aren't close. And something that was interesting in Harry's book is that he speaks about how, you know, the public perception of them as brothers was that they were really close, but Harry actually says they were quite separate when they were growing up. And it was very difficult. Obviously, there was a slight age difference, but they weren't this kind of united front. And I would say that that's probably deliberate by the powers that be. I definitely think that's deliberate. I think there was a reason that they separated them, so they could better indoctrinate them both into their roles. And also keep them as competition, because if they had been really connected as brothers, again, there's the threat that they might just say, do you know what? It doesn't matter, like, what anyone else thinks of us. They could give each other self-esteem, as sometimes this does happen, like in a miracle situation. You know what? We love each other. We care about each other. Who cares about any of this? Let's topple it. Let's just go. Let's neither of us play into this system. That's also the case in oppressive dynamics, isn't it? Like, solidarity is so important, because if we refuse to have a scapegoat, like the current scapegoat of the time, if we refuse that because we know it could fall on us, and we say, no, none of us are going to be your scapegoat, we are going to look at the problem which is at the top, then we have more power. So obviously there's systems in place in the royal family that creates jealousy and resentments. Like, you can see that bubbling over in what Harry writes about in his book. You know, there's this jealousy coming from William and this need to prove himself coming from Harry, and you just know that they've been raised without that kind of connection, which is part of their role. So yeah, this is probably all over the place. If you're interested in shows about, like, generational trauma and different family dynamics, like, I cannot recommend Succession enough. Succession is incredible. Also Umbrella Academy, if you're interested in a more kind of superhero vibe. The plot of the Umbrella Academy is literally just siblings with superpowers who have an abusive dad who controlled them, and it's like their struggles to connect as adults, and it's also kind of fun and really campy and fun. I love Umbrella Academy as well, and The Crown is really good. I wouldn't say the latest season is that great, actually. I feel like it kind of stepped back a bit, but yeah, the early seasons of The Crown up until the last season are really good for that. But let me know what you think. I've just been thinking a lot about that privileged victim idea and that situation, and how it seems like the same kind of argument that we make to people who are abused all the time, because remember, there's no perfect victim. So say, you know, in the case of Succession, the Roy kids came forward and said, we've been abused in the system and we want to make that public. The response to them would be, as it would be in the real world from a lot of people, I don't know why you're complaining because you're so wealthy. How can you say that about your father when he's materially provided for you? And it's the same sort of arguments we see being used against Harry, isn't it? It's how can you possibly make criticisms? And let's just say Harry's not an anti-monarchist, which I wish he was. He's not making huge criticisms. He is talking about some things which he thought were unfair, and he wants to progress things. But already he's getting that kind of guilting, which is, but how can you do that when, you know, you had all that wealth and that privilege? Like, how dare you? You're so wealthy. And people don't tend to think about how those things are tied together as ideas, and also about how they do that to every single victim. It doesn't matter what situation a victim's in, because if they come forward, they'll always find a reason to say, oh, you should be grateful to the person who abused you, or other people have it worse. So yeah, that's my video for today. Hope you enjoyed. I'll see you really soon for, like, probably a news roundup video. I'm not sure, but yeah, let me know what you think. yeah. All right, love you. Bye.